Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, the Praise of Fly podcast. Today's episode 99 of the Casual Stream. I'm once again joined by Florian. Glad to have you here, Florian. We are discussing Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed. That was a movie from Ben Stein. And Florian and I, we're continuing our discussion on where faith and science meet. So I thought this would be an excellent introduction to the intelligent design movement and the set of arguments that they have. So we'll open up with your thoughts, Florian. What did you think of the documentary?
Yeah, very interesting. I knew that the documentary existed, and when it came out, I was still working at NYU in the lab, and I was pretty much towards science. And I thought, I basically back then I thought it would just be it would be a waste of time for me to watch it because it's probably some crazy church freaks that talk about creationism and well, my mindset back then was that that you know creationists are kind of like they are there, and the reason why we don't see much of a challenge of traditional science or Darwinism by creationists is because they're simply irrelevant, right? Nobody takes them serious. But when I watched the movie, what was immediately apparent was that they were not just ignored; they were actually kicked out, right? So there was the example of one woman who talked like briefly in a slide or two on like about creationism, and then somebody somebody tattled apparently to the dean and said, "Oh, she teaches creationism," and then the dean kicked her out. Or as he later on said in an interview, he didn't kick her out. He just didn't extend her contract, which is for anyone who has ever been in the corporate world or in the government bureaucracy world, in the science world, that is the way to get rid of people you don't want to have around anymore, right? I mean, if you just kick them out directly, then that opens you up to the risk of a lawsuit. If you just let the contract expire, you have always plausible deniability, right? And that's the way this guy, the dean or whoever that was, talked in the interview. He said, yeah, we just simply never extended her contract, which is a very disingenuous framing. But yeah, um, knowing what happened to people that were pro-Trump and from 2016, 2020 already, they were also kind of blacklisted, kicked out, and I think that speaks to how people like how maybe normies or people that are just believing that everything is fine with the establishment science, establishment bureaucracy, and everything. They just assume that those people are gone because they just nobody listens to them, but it's not true. These people are actively blacklisted and actively kicked out, and that is something. If I had seen that movie earlier, if I had watched it earlier, I would have I would have been upset about that a lot earlier than now, right? Now I can compare these things to what happened in other aspects ever since the rise of Trump, but the strengthening of the conservative movement. But back then these things were also going on. Maybe not coincidentally with Obama's rise, right? I mean, that movie came out when 2011, 2010, somewhere around that time.
Somewhere around there, yeah.
Yeah, that was basically when Bush was Bush, or when Republicans didn't win the election, Obama won the election, or everything that had a twinge of conservatism to it was all of a sudden a very toxic brand, and so you'd think that that then maybe conservatism kind of fizzled out, but it was in many aspects actively blocked by the people that Obama brought in, and the new woke movement in the Democrats that basically started around then. Very sad, actually, but how I can maybe talk to a little bit how that works in practical terms, right? Um, Now, I said that contracts don't get extended, right? But there's also something else, like the editors of scientific journals, and scientific journals are very very important because every postdoc, every PhD student, which I have been as well, you try to make your paper and present and put it into one of the big journals, right? And then that goes into your CV. And then when you apply to another job, then the application board will look at that and say, he published in Nature, he published in Science, he published in Cell. Yeah, okay, this we can put this guy on the number three, and then the top three candidates, they give some talks, and then the faculty decides who they like best. That's usually how it works. And whoever gets the honor of having their study in published in Nature, that's a political decision. The study needs to be solid and needs to be novel, but there are certain times where the editors of Nature, Cell, and Science, they want to follow a fashion, right? So maybe in some months they have cell biology. Some other months they want to bring a lot of papers about stem cell research. And if you're just unlucky enough to have your topic not aligning with what is en vogue in a certain time, you don't get published in those top journals. You still get published in a good journal, but not in the top journals. And that is some sort of there's a sort of a science politics going on, right? And you can very easily see that that people that make a political decision that don't let you publish, they will certainly not allow any research to get in about intelligent design or creationism, right? And that's a very simple way how these people get basically never get a job in science. If they're there and talk about creationism, they get kicked out. That's what the movie showed in gentle or not so gentle ways. And then nobody else who talks about creationism, intelligent design will ever get a job at university. And I think I can imagine the same thing probably happens to people that doubt the global warming narrative. They probably also don't get a job. And yeah, I mean, I probably don't need to explain that that's wrong, but that's morally and ethically wrong. But that's how these things happen. Yeah.
So, let's look at the movie sort of as a stylistic first. I think the idea of using a lot of Cold War imagery and Cold War reels really was a good choice because it illustrated that the Academy was kind of a closed off Iron Curtain scenario.
Yep.
I thought that was and it was paced well, right? These Cold War images are not all over. They're paced at the right point in the film. You'll see some guards walking along the wall. You'll see some tanks. You'll see Stalin waving to the crowds. That was very good. I also liked how there was a lot of comedic presence interspersed in certain parts. Because the danger with comedic elements is if you use too much, it becomes stupid. It becomes stupid, right?
Yeah.
So you have to use it just enough to make your point, but not too much. And I think that was done well too. And the basic structure was the first maybe third of the documentary were the scientists that got blacklisted and fired for even discussing. They're not even teaching intelligent design; they're discussing it. Then the middle third was primarily about the arguments against evolution from a scientific perspective. And then the last third would be the consequences with that. That's where they got into Darwin and the Nazis and finally the discussion with Richard Dawkins. And that would be, I think that was that's like the three groupings within the documentary. I think that was done well too. So it was paced well, it was structured well. It had nice imagery. Like I said, the Cold War imagery was good. I think it's easily one of the best documentaries of that decade. And by the way, I checked, it came out in 2008.
Yeah, I agree. That was a very, very good way. It's a very good way to drive the narrative, right? To drive the story along. And I was especially happy that that basically they showed basically the Institute for Racial Hygiene. That's how they called it in Germany. I mean, hygiene. If you think about that, that's already a very bad connotation. But back then, not. I mean, back then, to be fair, some people probably thought differently back then and didn't think too much of it. But the word choice matters, and what they went basically to basically the story was about the consequences, right? At that point, they said, if people believe in Darwinism, then that was one of the arguments of the Nazis, right? They had propaganda movies where they said, in nature, everyone inferior doesn't survive in nature, and so if we help evolution along, then we get a very strong society. And there was a discussion whether Hitler was evil or good, and or whether the Nazis thought about they were doing good. I think they were just very very pragmatic. I think the Germans just wanted to call the shots and being without any enemy, right? They just wanted to kick out the competition or kill the competition. But then you had also many Nazis thought that they had an obligation towards the state, right? A very technocratic version of life. And in this technocratic version, you can say, oh yeah, there's Darwinism that justifies what we do, and so we can use that as blueprint to take our steps. And I have to say, I don't think Darwinism really said all this. There was a lot of misinterpretation probably, but there's also one or two aspects where Darwin himself said that how did he say that, like that no breeder of animals would ever allow an inferior animal to breed. So that's kind of self-evident, and that's if you apply that to human beings, then yeah, then you get what the Nazis did with undesirable people.
Remember, they also mentioned people were sterilized in the United States.
Margaret Sanger, right? And non coincidentally, I when I heard about that Margaret Sanger, that was when I looked into the abortion issue, and I realized that the proponents of abortion ultimately use that as a means to implement eugenics, right? So it's all very dark, right? And
Yeah.
I would actually add the movie didn't talk about that, but I would add the discussion about facilitated suicide to that as well, right? So you have the cases in Canada. Sometimes, apparently, the medical professionals in Canada will suggest that you should kill yourself because you are not really smart enough to make it in society or something like that. And that can be easily abused by families already, right? Can basically gaslight their grandparents into killing themselves to leave them the inheritance, right? That's certainly what some people are doing, and I think there's also like a large amount of there's a dark number, or how do they call it? There's a large amount of assisted or a large amount of actually murders where nurses murder patients that never gets discovered because it kind of flies under the radar, right? How do you know that somebody 75 years old gets a heart attack? That's to expect, right? Nobody will question whether that heart attack was helped along. And on a societal level, of course, that can also be abused, and that's all the consequences of Darwinism and also Malthusianism. And they also brought that, which is very interesting, because if you say, if Malthus said basically in the 19th century that the population of Earth, like human beings, we proliferate exponentially, but the resources will only proliferate linearly. So at one point we run out of resources, and the way the Nazis came up with the need to kill all undesirables, that was also ultimately because they want to have more resources for themselves. That's also a very Malthusian idea.
Yeah. So I think a lot of the interesting part for you would be as a biologist is the middle part where they go into sort of arguments, sort of scientific arguments from the ID perspective. The
Mhm.
first one that they really dig into is the idea that organic life, organic materials developing from inorganic materials are statistically so improbable that they might as well be impossible. That was the first argument. So, what did you think of that one, Florian?
Yes and no. I think in some cases, if you think that our DNA is statistically impossible to be brought about just by chance, that is true. But evolution also doesn't say that we all just like that. Nature just rolls the dice and then something comes out. It's more like Bayesian statistics, right? Where you say we lock in what works and then mutate further on from there. And so basically, you don't need to reinvent the wheel every time evolution works, right? Evolution just works with what is there and discards what is not working with the current environment. Um, but it's also true that there's this one experiment where they show that the Miller-Urey experiment, where they showed that yes, abiotic material can become biotic through a large infusion of energy, like the primordial soup. Uh, there's a lot of like electric discharge in the atmosphere, a lot of thunderstorms, and so there's energy to make new self-replicating molecules. But and they could reproduce that in a lab setting. They could show that you could get some amino acids with that, but that didn't really explain everything, right? Then everyone takes the leap. Oh, okay, if you can abiotically create amino acids, probably also the rest. We just didn't see it in our setting. No, maybe you didn't see it in your setting because it wasn't possible after all, right? And also, and also, this life cannot just come from like one one little puddle of primordial soup. This needs to be an event that happened in many cases all over the entire globe, and there are some weaknesses to say that it's just coming from an energy discharge into a primordial soup. Also, I would think that we should see that today still. There must be regions on the world where there's a strong thunderstorm, and then you would also see spontaneous creation of amino acids. I don't think you see that, but I also don't know whether people are looking for that. But it's basically they made one experiment, um, and then that's basically it. That says, okay, phew, we have we have the origin explained. No, you haven't. You didn't explain the origin. You just kicked the can down the road. You didn't explain how this really came to being, right?
Well,
Just that
real
some
quick,
aspects can
to-
evolve,
to-
but
so one of the points that you made, though, the jump from chemistry to biology, inorganic matter to organic matter, is not selecting for something that's already there and preserving it. It's
right,
not there. It's chemistry, and it's not yet biology. And the argument that they make is that the jump from chemistry to biology, whenever that is purported to have happened, is so statistically improbable that it couldn't have happened without some intelligent agent behind it. That is the narrative that they use. Now, one of the opposition proponents was Michael Roos, where he said that there's the crystals that that it would yeah.
yeah,
But here's the thing, right? He the core of his argument was little bits of change over time add up to a lot of change. Now, okay, in one sense, that's true, and we all admit that's true. But here's the problem that I see with this. If you were to have an army and you were to keep adding soldiers to the roster, no arithmetic addition of more soldiers will improve the quality of the army. That's going to take training. That's an entire different process by which you improve the quality of the army, not just the numbers. And so what the chemistry to biology jump is this problem. You're adding more soldiers to the roster of the army, but you're not actually improving the quality. The quality jump has to be made through some other mechanism. In the case of the army, i.e., it's the training from the drill instructor.
yeah. I think that's also some idea I had while I was watching the movie. Um, the attacks against creationism, they all happened around 2010, 2011. But why never before? All of a sudden, creationism was attacked. And it was always framed as like a last effort of the Bushite evangelicals to assert themselves. But really, it's more like science. As a scientist, you go into science to a certain extent because you think that religion is just bullshitting you, and you want to check for yourself. You want to have experiments that prove you want to put a question out there, and you form a hypothesis. Then that you can test, and then you do the experiments to test this hypothesis, and then you can say, well, in the context of that hypothesis, at least I've seen with my own eyes, I tested it. There was a control group, there was an experiment, and now I know that that is this way or that is the other way. And there's no Bible that I need to believe in. But you know, why does there need to be such a hostility towards the Bible? Why do you need to engage in science to fight off religion. That's almost what it became. I mean, why? That hasn't been, once again, that hasn't really been the case. It hasn't been weaponized that much in 2000 or 2005, and all of a sudden you have this battle against the evil creationists who want to defile science. It's almost like a would you even, maybe even an eschatological argument, like the end times, the religious types defile the holy signs, and you have the same ways. It's basically a religious battle, if you will, right? Basically, you could see science as a counter gang, trying to fight the evangelicals, but it's you know it, it's really silly. You don't need to make a decision for science against religion. You can believe in both, right? And
Yeah.
but that seems and then you come up with inept explanations. Man, it's okay to say we don't know, but why do you need to come up with yeah? Well, evolution is like, well, life could have hitched piggyback on some crystals, and then crystals mutated, and then okay, man. But is that really a solid argument you're making there? Why not just say I don't know?
Yeah. Well, so a few things here. You're from Germany, but in the 70s and 80s, there was the battle between a sort of like media and like public debate scene between Darwinists and creationists, and that never really went away. I mean, Keith and I discussed the new atheist movement, and that was in part weaponized to undercut evangelicalism. So part of that, I think, is political. Part of that was to undercut the Bush base by doing this.
Yeah.
And then furthermore, the I want to make a distinction again between, they didn't really make it clearly in the video. I guess they assumed that the viewer would know. The difference between intelligent design and creationism is this. Intelligent design is primarily focused on biology, and it doesn't really talk about geology or astronomy. Creationism does. It does also include claims about astronomy and geology, as well as biology. And some of the biological claims that both groups make are overlapping. But intelligent design is a more narrow focus, and that's what the video was about. The let's see, what were some of the other moments that they had about the selection. So the other thing would be the cell. They talked about the cell and how they didn't see. This is where it would have been helpful if they brought in not Dembski, but Michael Behe with irreducible complexity again. They mentioned how complex the cell is. Now, why is that a powerful argument? That's one area where I think the documentary wasn't strong. And that's because the concept of irreducible complexity, if you have a system that's working and you remove any one part from the system fails. And so from an intelligent design perspective, the idea would be, if you have a set lungs, right, and then you want to, or sorry, gills, and then you want to evolve lungs through gradual processes, at any intermediate point, you don't have a functioning system. You don't have functioning gills and you don't have functioning lungs, which means then it's not going to be adaptive. That animal's going to die. And so that's why the complexity of the cell is considered such an important argument. It's so complex that it could not have been developed. That's the implied conclusion. It couldn't have developed gradually through iterative changes. Yeah. So what did you think of that? Again, they didn't fully flesh it out, but that's sort of my work on it.
Yeah, so with irreducible complexity, it's important to find out what the linchpin actually is, because many mutations, and I think I said that last time, many mutations that you have in the lab. I mean, we did. There were in the 80s and 90s, several labs did large scale screens, which means they induced random mutations into flies and zebrafish, and then they basically took the zebrafish that still developed and the flies that still developed somewhat normal, but not all the flies just died when you mutate them. Some of them survived, but then they had basically extra appendages, or they had smaller eyes or something like that. I worked on a zebrafish mutation that was called Silberblick, and if you take that gene away, then the eyes of the fish will during embryonic development will be closer together. Silberblick means somebody who is cross-eyed in German. in Germany. And so basically, you have certain, and we found that the gene regulates the movement of cells. So if the cell movement is a little bit sluggish, you don't get the tissue that separates the initial. There, you have when you develop, you have an initial eye field. There are cells that are specified to become eyes, and there's other tissue that comes from behind and separates that field into the left and the right eye. And when these cells come from behind, they are not as fast to come from behind. They're a little sluggish. Then you only get a partial or no division of that eye field, and you get cyclopia or eyes that are more narrow together. So that is something that would still work. Here you take a gene away and the fish doesn't die. It just has a different eye shape. And you can make the argument also in nature. I mean, we have different facial shapes, right? So we have different genetics, and some of our facial features will be different based on the genes. So not all the genes that you take away make an organism fall apart. But there are some genes that if you take them away, it wouldn't work anymore. And the argument that evolutionary biologists say is basically you take evolution sorts out what can still survive and what can't.
Okay, yeah. Now, because when I watched it yesterday, I realized Expelled was more about how certain intellectuals were getting blacklisted, or rather than arguments for intelligent design, which I mean is fine. The idea that a government-funded universities and colleges are blacklisting intellectuals is a problem, and that's important that they bring that out. And the thing that I think was the initial reaction from a lot of secular Darwinian New Atheist community at the time was that this was bad faith. But Hitchens, Dawkins, we've both seen some of their performances. What Ben Stein shows us is not selected edits to make them look bad. They really do look this bad all the time. Like, the entire Dawkins debate with Lennox, the entire Hitchens debate with Doug Wilson, they're like this all the time. They're not, it wasn't like, Ben Stein just waited to get a gotcha moment. They really were that obnoxious. Yeah. And the thing that's interesting about Dawkins, and I asked Grok about this at one point, is if he really was a person who was serious and not, as I propose, someone just doing this for money, he wouldn't have attacked the theistic evolutionists, because if his goal was to defend evolution and defeat the creationists and defeat intelligent design, he would have allied. Remember, he said to Ben Stein, if I go to court and I say this, that's going to hurt Eugenie Scott. That's going to hurt the science literacy crowd. And it's like, well, then okay. But if your goal was to defend evolution, then you would have just kept your mouth shut. Because as you admit, that hurts their case against the creationists. Because think about the election of, was it 1912, when Woodrow Wilson was elected. The Republican vote was split because Teddy Roosevelt ran as the Bull Moose ticket. And so what Dawkins is sort of doing is splitting the evolution side so that, the creationists have more oxygen, even though his argument is you shouldn't give them oxygen. It's counterintuitive, which is why I think once you see all of the evidence, right, we've seen Dawkins in 86 for the Huxley Memorial debate. We've seen him in 2007 with his debate with Lennox. We've seen him here. This guy just doesn't have any principles. He just keeps saying whatever he thinks people want him to say. And that's what you've been saying, Florian. You've been saying that someone like Dawkins just doesn't have a backbone.
Yeah, and you think about current developments. You look like I don't know whether you followed that, but there's a current attempt by the intellectual dark web, like Eric Weinstein and Douglas Murray and the other guy. I always mistake them, but they go on Rogan and Jordan Peterson, and they go on Rogan and basically they try to gatekeep him by because like he has these people like Dave Smith on who give a different narrative on contemporary politics, like in more concrete structures. It's about Israel here, but there's the same ineptitude of people like Douglas Murray. He comes across like an unlikable British aristocrat, telling people, basically asserting his gatekeeping authority that he just doesn't have anymore, right? And that also splits, in this case, the neoliberal, neoconservative neoconservative political faction, because he basically makes them look very unsympathetic, and yeah, and then people, they don't follow them anymore in any way anymore, and now he makes it worse. And you seem to have like some of these people that are brought out to bask in the sunlight of fame and fame and honor, and come out, maybe not honor but fame. They come on the stage and everyone buys their books, but then then they continue, and they discredit their whole entire movement that's behind them unwittingly. And there's a you know it's very apparent more and more to me um, when you look at that the time from 2008 to 2012 was sort of like a changing time where wokeists were exerting themselves, where the whole Obama fraction were making more inroads into solidifying their hold on the narrative in society, right? If you look at if you watch like older movies, older TV shows from that time, you sometimes get narratives that are switching from, that are basically reflecting also that God doesn't care and God is stupid, and I'm wondering how that all fits together in one political agenda. It
Well,
was an agenda against the to get the Bushite evangelicals
that's what I think it
eliminated.
was. Yeah, that's I think what it was.
It
And
probably was, yeah, yeah, yeah.
I heard that from Keith, who heard it from well, I forget his name. Let me look him up a second. Yeah, I asked Keith Preston about this before our show, and he said he heard it from Caleb Maupin. I'm like, that's a very plausible argument. The other thing is they interview a guy named, I think, Will Provine, talking about the implications of Darwinism. No free will, no afterlife, none of these things that are associated with religion. Now, one of the things that's interesting about him is at the end of the film, he says, I don't care what you believe. I don't care if you're a creationist. And I'm like, well, if you don't have free will, then that's actually a pretty consistent position. So I guess I should give Provine props for that, right? He's at least consistent. But what do you think about his claim that the things he says follow from a Darwinian worldview?
Which thing specifically?
Well, let me see if I can find the script here. Provine says there's no free will. That's one of the things he says that doesn't follow. There's no afterlife. There's no God. There's no design. There's no meaning. Yeah, those are the things he says that follow. Do you remember that section?
Yeah, I sort of remember that because it reminds me of like the basically the garden variety neoliberal will tell you the same, and that's how I was brought up basically. Also, like the '90s narrative was a little bit like that. It was I will never forget that I talked to friends about when I studied biochemistry, and I sat with them in the cafeteria and we are discussing about how to learn best or stuff like that. And we talked to another like older biochemist, and he told us we can style our own work day and everything, right? We can do whatever we want, and it's a great subject to study, biochemistry. And I back then had the opinion that you should really basically almost live a monk-like existence to honor science, right? To be a scientist, that's an honor, and you need to be completely in. Meaning, to me, that back then meant to have a monk-like existence. And they told me, no, that's not what our friend said. You can do whatever you want. Don't bog yourself down in being a monk. Don't think there's any obligation on you. Do what you want to do. And that was the prevailing consensus of the '90s. There was no place for God. Religion had like maybe religion was associated with conservative people that were out of touch, and so everyone thought, was my age and maybe a little younger, maybe a little older, we all thought that it's just about having fun in life. That's it, right? There's no afterlife. We just arrive on the scene, and that was that, and then we're gone. And only over time you realize that maybe not everything about that is true, but scientists, mostly coming from that point, and they all think that way, and it's a very sad view, and it's probably also not a correct view, but that's how you can explain this historically, how he thinks that.
Well,
he's
Oh, yeah,
actually an interesting person because in the very beginning he said intelligent design is boring, boring. He was like
yeah.
almost aggressively. You could see his body language. He was almost contorting himself. He was like really hating it, right? And then in the end, he becomes more conciliatory. I found that an interesting development throughout the movie. I thought this guy was like utterly intolerant at the beginning, and in the end, he had a nihilistic perspective, but he was at least becoming a little bit more conciliatory.
Well, more
Also,
car than Richard Dawkins. Can you believe it?
Richard Dawkins kicked the can down the road, right? So in the movie, the Richard Dawkins said it's possible that there's maybe an alien uh, civilization. Of course, they have arisen through evolution, and this alien civilization decided they seed life on Earth. And then, of course, you have to think about what, who brought those aliens to life, and then who brought the people that brought them to life. And yeah, that's a big problem. You kick the can down the road. Ultimately, what comes before the Big Bang? You don't
Yeah.
know, right? And
Well,
and
yeah.
yeah,
Well, to your point again, also, where did this like war between science and religion come from? I actually think going back to our discussion with Max Planck and on religion and natural science, he actually, I think, tells us, sort of helps us understand that, because he argues that atheism as a political movement within science is tied to the logical positivists. And he views the rise of logical positivism as the rise of atheism, which would destroy science and also
yeah.
lead to a war with religion. So I actually think Planck saw this at the very beginning back in 1937, and then Richard Dawkins is the end result of what he was warning. What do you think about that?
I think Max Planck, and I know how these old school scientists were thinking in Germany. I didn't overlap with Max Planck or his generation, but we had some professors in Hanover who were old school, and from talking to them, it's I think they would have found Dawkins very, very obscene, almost like the way I remember one professor who was basically uh, who was a zoology professor. He was a little bit older, but he basically he used every exam that he had. He used it as a personal exercise in teaching us all about the different memorabilia that he had in his office. It was like full of, like, he had like large sea urchins that were somehow I think he dived himself. He caught them in the Caribbean or somewhere there, right? He had like lots of his. He was like completely. He loved being a zoologist, and this guy was full of happiness and full of life and full of intellectual power also. And someone like Dawkins just strikes me as a McDonald's version of that. It's like there's just nothing. There's just nothing. There's just nothing. I mean, is there any? I cannot imagine Dawkins as someone who would tell you the wonders of the world. Although I have to say, to be fair, I think he published a later book where he showed some of the beauty of nature. So maybe that's a little arc for Dawkins, getting back into thinking there's some creation. At least he admires the beauty of nature. But this his glibness is just a complete letdown, right? If you're interested and curious about science, and even Darwin wanted to have an explanation for the beauty of nature, right? And these new atheist types, they're just completely bland, boring, and yeah, pointless.
Yeah. So the other thing that we see with this, along with the earlier debates with Dawkins and Hitchens that we've done, is it's so telling, right? How they don't actually have to argue things like incredulity or boring or they're religious fundamentalists or this or that, right? None of these objections are scientific objections to a theory. These are just gatekeepers using boilerplates. And Ben Stein collects a lot of these boilerplates and then puts them into the documentary. And I think that's really telling because, you know, as he said, about halfway through the documentary, this kind of reaction strikes at something deep at the heart of this institution. It isn't just the scientific objection. And that's where they go back into the question of meaning again. A lot of these guys, didn't want to have to deal with the question of meaning, and that's why they cut this out. There was a famous evolutionary scientist named Richard Lewontin who said that he wasn't included in the documentary, but it's apropos. We don't allow a divine foot in the door, because so we accept the absurdities of Darwinian theory not because of science, because we don't want a divine foot in the door. And that would have been a great quote to have in the documentary, but either Ben Stein didn't know about it or they didn't put it in. But yeah, he's on record as saying that, and that's the issue here. It's really not a scientific objection. And there were two guys who talked about this. One was there was that Christian guy that Ben Stein talks to. Then there was that secular liberal guy that Ben Stein talks to. And they both said that no, these are not scientific claims. These are, political or philosophical claims. And that properly understood, there's no need to have a conflict.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Was there anything you wanted to add to that or comments on?
I think the argument that best fits the entire question between religion and science is that one complements the other, and I'm not quite sure. It should be easy to understand and to basically reframe the entire discussion in those terms, right? If those two complement one another, you don't need any conflict, right? And it's just understood that religious scholar and scientists work on different aspects of reality. But it was brought to a battle, and that was really unnecessary. But there was probably, as you mentioned, Caleb Maupin saying, and Keith telling you, there's probably an ulterior motive behind it, right?
Yeah.
Probably the evangelicals were also a little bit unfairly. They were unfairly portrayed as being the evil behind the Republican Party. Like you had these documentaries about the how's it called? This super extreme religious community, Southern Baptist. These guys that go out and God hates fags and these guys.
Oh yeah.
But those are basically and maybe they're very nice if you get to know them, but they're basically clowns that are serving to they're basically their role is to incite the 2 minutes of hatred that you had in George Orwell's 1984, right? It's basically red herring you put out there, and now everyone thinks, oh, these evil guys, and they must be behind Bush's evil terror regime, we now need to really get rid of them and root, stem, and trunk, and that's a very dangerous proposition to have. But that was sort of like from what I remember, that was the overall mentality or mindset of many people on the left. We need to really get rid of all these right wingers, although there was never really a need, right? Obama populated Washington D.C. with all his people. Washington D.C. was basically in like 2-3 years. It was all Democrats. It was all Starbucks shops. It was all the typical institutions that the Democrat crowd, the liberal crowd likes. And there was never any need to denigrate the evangelicals. You basically could accept that they are there. And yes, some of them think there's the end times coming and whatever, but they're not really that dangerous that you need to you don't need to really turn it into a religious struggle. What I find also interesting is that all these secular scholars, they pride themselves of not being any, and they're not adhering to any religion. But then they use words from religion like evil, like those people are evil, the people that don't agree with them, and that's a very interesting framing of language also that I hear. It's it's almost like it's some form of mass psychosis that some people that were on the pro science crowd are under.
So somebody from the chat mentioned Westboro Baptist. Yeah. So thanks, Obsidian Fame. So yeah, that was that. The other thing is the personalities that Ben Stein talks to. That's also that's another great aspect of the casting of the documentary. What did you think of David Berlinski? I thought he was one of the best characters in the film.
What was it? What who was it that did, was it that
David
the guy?
Berlinski was that hoity-toity Jewish guy in Paris.
Okay, I may not remember much of David Berlinski. Can you help me
Yeah,
out?
yeah. Well, he's the one that's always reclining in the chair, smoking, and he's talking to Ben Stein
Yeah,
in an apartment building. Do you remember him?
yeah, I remember him. What
Yeah.
were some of the arguments he brought?
Well, no, but like we're looking. He so Ben Stein brings in a lot of different people for the show, right?
Yeah.
Both atheists, a Darwinian, and for and against. And I was asking you who was one of your favorite personas that was interviewed or discussed. Mine is David Berlinski. He's one of my favorite personas. He's pretty good.
Yeah,
Both good.
I would say also my favorite persona from the vibes he gave off was like a nice relaxed university professor with his pipe. I think he smoked a pipe, right? Or his declining chair. But for me, I'm catching the vibe of people first, and I'm not always remembering their exact arguments what they said.
Right. No. Well, so for him, he was just saying that Dawkins is speaking out of turn when he's a scientist criticizing religion, which is correct. Originally, the cell was thought to be simpler than it is now understood to be at present, which is also correct. But he was the one that actually brought up the connection to euthanasia and abortion. He says that Darwinism gives a impetus to arguments in favor of euthanasia and abortion. And I thought overall he was a very interesting component of that documentary.
Yeah, yeah. He basically that makes sense that he is shown in the third part of the movie where the consequences are discussed. Yeah, very good part, and things like that. People like Dawkins never really talk about that, right? It was good that Ben Stein brought that out, what the consequences really are, and yeah, I think I'm not sure whether I was always more on the standpoint that scientists should be allowed to do anything, and then society should make a judgment of what to do with the findings. But it's an old question, right? Do scientists have a moral compulsion? Do science have a moral obligation? That's the word. Do scientists have a moral obligation to to stop their finding or to moderate their findings in a certain way because they can be abused, right? Dürrenmatt, of course, wrote the play The Physicists, where basically he discusses that people like Einstein helped bring about the nuclear bomb and stuff like that. And so that's an old question, and maybe it's a bit disappointing that Dawkins never talks about that. But
Yeah,
there is, I think, the way it's not the way that it's not the fault of Darwinists that people, it's not the fault of Darwin that Hitler used that ideology, but if you are scientists nowadays, if you're someone like Dawkins, you willingly let yourself be part of an ideological crusade for yourself to garner some status points. And I think that is despicable, and that's the real problem. We have a lot of people that are now just propagandizing stuff, and I wonder whether Dawkins was one of the people with whom that, or the new atheist was one of the movements with which that all started, right? So you have people that claim to be experts, and they are really only gatekeepers, right? And they basically are sometimes gatekeepers of an evil ideology. And I'm using that word good and evil because I believe there's such a thing as good and evil in society. But it's an ideology that's very hostile towards humanity, right? And people like Dawkins just let them just be the experts. They're not much experts because that's also an interesting thing. They're not really challenged, right? Nobody challenges Dawkins. Like I know scientists that think he's kind of a dick, and they kind of like ignore him, but nobody says anything against him. And these people are just accepted to roll along, and they're just grifters, and there's grifters of a very bad ideology, and And Dawkins is not really a smart person in the way he argues. He can be easily refuted by scholars that know more, that read Dawkins' books 20 times, when Dawkins only read Lennox's book the night before the debate. It was one very funny thing I found from Dawkins and Lennox debate.
Yeah, yeah.
So these people are not used to being challenged. This is also an interesting part that many on the left have. They are now exposed to having to confront arguments from the conservative side, and they completely fail. Conservatives are able to think themselves in have the a conservative has the ability to imagine himself he was a liberal and use their arguments. Liberals do not have the ability to do that in the other direction. I find that with religious people also, they have the ability to think themselves into the scientist's mind, but the scientist is not able to understand the religious person. And for that reason, the religious people always have a better argument there in the debate.
Well, yeah, I would agree, but I think we're nearing the end. So what I'd like to just sum up here is Expelled was meant to introduce people who had never heard of intelligent design to intelligent design, primarily from the angle of suppression by academic interests of investigation and scholarship, and then digging into some of the implications of Darwinism with regards to eugenics, the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, and abortion. There we go. And so the actual arguments in favor of intelligent design, this isn't like so in one sense, it's a pro-intelligent design film, and that it's trying to argue, hey, let these guys study science. But it's not a pro-intelligent design film in the sense of these are the arguments that we as intelligent design people have, and we're going to go step by step by step to show you what they are. So it's a very gentle introduction, and I think it was useful and necessary at the time, given the kind of lockout that existed. Oh, the other thing I'll add is it's funny. They wanted the scientific establishment at the end. You remember at the end when Berlinski and those two other guys are talking about they would love to see the scientific establishment lose its credibility?
Mhm.
Well, it did, but it wasn't due to Darwinism. It was due to COVID and gender. Due to COVID and gender.
Yeah.
I mean, when scientists can't tell you what a woman is, and when scientists redefine what a vaccine is just for political reasons, the entire establishment, and then the reproducibility crisis, right? But all of that was years and years ahead in the future, and ultimately had nothing to do with intelligent design or evolution. But they got their wish. The scientific establishment did look pretty bad after this. Go ahead.
Yeah, and also I would I would add to that something that Mike Cernovich brought up. He said that the scientific establishment believes in evolution and can tell you exactly how many years ago what organism evolved and so, but they cannot tell you from the DNA whether COVID was a lab origin or not, right? So
Yes, yes, exactly. So before we wrap it up, Florian, what would be your final thoughts on the documentary? And
I think it's a
how would you rate it?
I think it's a 9 out of 10. I think it's a documentary, and I'm out, maybe even 10 out of 10. But they did leave some things open with the complexity of the cell, and they also gave you more an introduction to political part rather than the arguments in favor of evolution, creationism, intelligent design against it, and so on and so forth. But overall, it was very important, I think, and anyone who thought they didn't really need to watch it, I would watch it because it doesn't talk about intelligent design is so much better. No, it talks about how people actually were kicked out of the establishment of scientific establishment, where it was an eye opener for me because I thought those people were just ignored and withered away, right, in some lab somewhere in the corner. But no, those people were actively blacklisted, and that makes it a very that makes it a very that puts it on the whole moral level. And I think it's important that somebody points that out. And yeah, that was a surprising thing for me, but also a good thing about the movie.
All right. Well, thanks again, Florian. This is Todd Lewis of the President Podcast signing off.